So, since scope creep is a real thing with Danielle and myself, instead of returning the office 100% to the way that it was, we are taking the opportunity to completely redo and overhaul this room. So I've already got my plans already drawn up. I've got my two upper desk side cabinets, the really big bookshelf up top, the printer desk, basically. It's just going to be all printers, the two printers that we have, plus my 3D printer, and then the cabinet right by our desks. So I've already got those mapped out on plywood. So I know at most this is going to take 5 sheets of regular plywood, this is going to take 5 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. But what I've already done here is go through all of my scraps, and I've pulled out every scrap piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I have. They're not going to match wood-wise. Like, this is birch, I got a bunch of oak, I think there's a sheet of pine in there somewhere. But this is all going to be painted, so I really don't care what the wood texture is going to be, because I'm not going to be able to see it anyway. And this will definitely save a lot of the full sheets. Yes, I'll still have to break into a couple of them, I'm sure, but hopefully I can save it and do maybe 3.5 instead of 5 sheets, so let's go there. I've already gone through and denailed everything, or cleaned it up, made sure that I'm going to have good wood to work with. So let's start lopping it off on the, what is that called? The big scary thing. Table saw, that's what they're called. So I think the best thing to do here is to start with the upper bookshelf cabinet, because that one is going to be enclosed on pretty much all sides with walls. So I can use some of the rougher, bigger sheets for the two outside ones there, and use some of the nicer stuff for more of the middle, where you're going to see some flaws and holes and stuff like that a little bit more. So let's start with that. And with that, the office cabinets can officially start construction. Since I'm using a lot of scrap or reclaimed material, it's a bit more of a chore to keep track of what pieces I actually have. I started by going through and cutting what I could to the maximum width that I could, making sure to mark the width on the cut scraps with some painter's tape and a pen to make sure that I didn't forget and recut them even smaller. I suppose since we're painting these anyway, I could have just scribbled all over these with a pencil and it wouldn't have mattered, but whatever. With the bulk of the scraps cut to width, I moved on to cutting them to final length. To cut the wider pieces, aka the ones I couldn't fit on my miter saw, I set up my crosscut supports on the workbench and zipped them down with a speed square and a circular saw. Then the ones I couldn't fit on the miter saw, I used the miter saw. Cutting the large pieces to width left me a fair bit of long, skinny scraps of plywood. Luckily, these are still useful to me as either the cabinet or shelf braces. So I went back to the table saw and ripped them all to width, followed again by the miter saw to cut them all to length. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get all of the cabinetry out of scraps, so I did need to break into another full sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. But again, this is all going to be painted, so I don't really care what the wood grain looks like. I just didn't want this project to cost me an arm and a leg, and being able to cobble the majority of about 4 sheets worth of scrap material together definitely saved up to my knee and maybe a wrist. With all of my pieces cut to size, I swap my router table insert over to my pocket hole insert and start pocket holing not all, but a good chunk of the pieces. Not really any particular reason why I went with pocket holes over whatever else, but something I did notice that I didn't do, particularly on my big bookshelf. It is a good idea to make sure that when you have 2 pieces getting screwed in next to each other, offset the pocket holes so that the screws don't end up colliding and blowing out the wood in the middle ward. With the pocket holing done, it's time for at least the first batch of sanding. Since a lot of this plywood came from my in-laws' old entertainment center built-ins, they all had finish or glue on them on one or both sides. When my wife and I were choosing our color palette for the office, we did a sample board from a scrap that didn't have the old finish sanded off, and the paint was fairly easily scratched off after it dried. So to keep the paint intact long term, I spent many hours sanding the old finish off. And again, since a good chunk of the materials were reclaimed, there were a few scratches, scrapes, tear-outs, etc. that all needed filling. So I just hit them with some plaster and made sure that when it came to building the cabinets, those sides were either hidden one way or another, typically against the wall or inside one of the drawer units. With the first batch of sanding done, I moved on to edge banding. I had a decent system set up with the hand screw clamp screwed down onto the workbench. I was able to then hold the pieces upright, which let me put a lot more force down into the iron to get the edge banding to better adhere to the plywood. This worked, however, my shoulder was killing me for the next week or so after doing this. Seriously, next time I'm doing this many cabinets, please just remind me to invest in an actual edge bander. Keith, looking at you. Thanks. Now that the edge banding is at least installed, I need to cut it flush. Converting my pocket hole station back into a router table, I throw a 1/4 inch round over bit into the router and set it so that the router bit is just barely hitting the plywood. Yes, I could use an actual flush cutting bit, however I found that the round over works a little bit better. Since it is still a round over bit but cutting before the actual round over portion starts, it does a little bit better job of just trimming the edge banding to just a hair width inside the edge of the plywood, which does a little bit better job at preventing the edge banding from getting ripped off when you slide the plywood around. Not that I still didn't have to reseat some of them, but it helped. And again, back to sanding. Many more hours of sanding. That is something else I think I will need to upgrade soon. The vibrations from this one definitely aren't great for my hands, and it's sounding more and more like there's a lot of gravel running through it. I did pick up a replacement sometime after this project, but if you have any other random orbit sander recommendations, please let me know in the comments below. At this point, with all of the pieces prepared and sanding completed, Danielle wanted to help build cabinets.
Oh no!
I like how you did. Hi, I'm here. I'm building things. And then you stopped, so I hit record. And then you go, building.
Whenever Danielle helps, there's blooper reels.
There is bloopers. Basically, just a lot of gluing and pocket screwing. And while assembling the printer cabinet here is where I noticed that there were more common collisions with the pocket hole screws. Overall, not a big deal, but it could have been something that was avoided with a little bit more forethought. To fill in the bookshelf pocket holes, at least the ones I remember to do, I cut up several segments of dowel, glued them into place, and cut them flush after the glue dried. For some reason though, I forgot to do this to the massive bookshelf and didn't realize it until the shelf was installed. So I filled those in with wood filler in place prior to painting. The 2 bookshelves that will be installed on either side of the window and over the desks got a ton of holes drilled into them for shelf pins, as we are not yet 100% sure what will be stored next to the desks as opposed to the main bookshelf, which will hold books, shockingly enough. Each shelf for the big bookshelf was measured and installed at typical heights of novels, at least based on my sample pool of what novels we already had. Now that everything is assembled, it is time for install. First things first, bringing everything inside from the shop.
Buddy!
And yes, Aries is wearing a tie. He's fancy. The first unit I decided to install was the massive bookshelf, pretty much because it was the biggest piece and it was in my way. I marked out the studs based on the exposed screws on the bottom of the wall, and marked out plumb lines along the studs, and then marked out the height for the permanent support cleat, which I tacked into place with the cordless nailer and screwed in permanently with these massive screws. These are the screws that are holding everything up.
Beefy.
Yep. Holding up a lot of books, so I was gonna...
Should you show the camera, but do it like an influencer and be like, these are the screws we're using to hold everything up.
If you want to.
Like an influencer.
Yeah. Then I could get my brother-in-law to help me lift the bookshelf into place and hold it up while I screw it down. And with 16 of these screws holding the shelf up, as well as the permanent cleat underneath with another 4, this shelf isn't going anywhere. The corner bookshelves on the opposite wall were installed much the same way. With my floor space now cleared out and the ability to move around restored, I removed that last little bit of baseboard in the alcove that made it through the original renovation, and now I could bring the printer cabinet in. This one was a little bit more of a pain. I more or less centered it in the alcove and screwed down the bottom into the framing. This gave me a little bit more of an anchor point to rack the carcass straight, since it was slightly on the parallelogram side of things, but with a level referencing the verticals in the bookshelf above, I was able to shift it over and screw it down into place to keep it square. The desk side cabinets, I didn't have the same issue, or at the very least I didn't notice if it did. I just had to make sure that everything was installed in the correct location for the countertop support frames to mount into place, which they did. Now that all of the carcasses are installed, I can start filling in the gaps between the walls and the carcasses. I decided to go with the budget-friendly 2x4s for this, since again, it's going to be painted, and it's not like they are going to be high contact surfaces. Like really, after this project is done, they really won't be touched again unless we are dusting or painting the cabinets again. This process basically just involved a lot of back and forth between the office and the shop, but eventually the pieces fit with a little bit of freehanding work with the table saw. Which I wouldn't really recommend doing, but I'm confident in my skills and tools at this point to get the job done. At this point, since it is soon time for painting, it would be best to get the baseboards installed now so that they could get caulked in, as well as any gaps in the filler pieces caulked as well. Looks like I didn't get any video of it, but we did have my mom over for a couple days to get the priming and painting of everything done. Remember all of those shelf pinholes? Q-tips are the perfect size to get in there. Not just for jamming into your ear canal. I think there were 2 coats of primer and 3 coats of paint overall, which was a lot of work. There is a lot of square footage in that bookshelf. Thanks, Mom. Danielle and I really appreciate your help. With the painting completed, or at least in terms of the video progression mostly completed, I think that's where I'm going to call it for now. The office renovation will continue in the next video, where we tackle the window and make it a little bit more cat friendly, since they're going to be up there all the time anyway. Thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to reading them in the comment section below. And if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can always follow me on Instagram at John the Schreiner. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video, and have a good one.